This project is a little bit different in that the clients had the chairs and the table legs already, and so it was partially a retrofit and partially a rebuild. They wanted a new walnut top, and then they wanted the legs and the chairs all painted. I have a local supplier who sells walnut rough sawn, and I was able to get all the boards that I needed from him. What that means for me is that I've got to go through the process of planing and joining and getting everything to an S4S state before I can start the actual glue up and build process. But the cost savings is typically worth the extra work. I'm able to get it for about half the price per board foot. My first step was to just rough length everything. I knew the table had to be 72 inches long, and so I went ahead and cut the 12-foot boards in half. And I got one board that was about 8 feet, so all I had to do was cut a couple of feet off of it. Next, I figured out which one was the thickest and started the process of sending them through the planer. This part of the build actually took about 2.5 to 3 hours, just getting everything dimensioned down to the same thickness and trying to get a little bit of a twist out of it through the planer. One of the pieces that I sent through came out the other side with that distinct metal shine, and I figured I had ruined some of the carbide teeth, so I started pulling out what I figured was a nail, and it turned out to be the lead from a 22 round. I pulled in total about 6 of them out. Somebody had used the tree in years past for target practice, but once they were all out, I continued on the process of getting 2 parallel faces. Once I was done with the planer, I took everything over to the joiner to smooth up a third side. The hope here is to get it 90 degrees to one of the flat faces. But with joiners, that isn't always a guarantee. This joiner especially tends to have a little bit of problem with the fence staying perpendicular to the bed. Once I had got everything through the joiner, I took it over to the table saw and made sure my table saw blade was at 90 degrees. And then sent each of the pieces through, taking off as little as possible. The table had to be 34 inches wide, and I knew I had about 40 inches of material or so, but I still wanted to leave everything as wide as possible. Once I had everything milled out, S4S that surfaced 4 sides, I laid everything out on the bench and tried to figure out which orientation would look the best before I started any of my glue-up process. When I found the orientation that I liked the best, I started marking out for biscuits and then went ahead and got those cut in. I use the biscuits for alignment, and I don't really think that they add any strength at all. But with a piece like this, since I have to go back through and sand off all the seams, I still put them in. I did number the end of each board so that when I went to put them back together, I could tell right away if they were oriented the way that I had them originally or not. And then I used the biscuit joiner to cut the slots. Through this next section of video, it looks like the glue up went really, really smooth, but it actually did not at all. Once I had everything clamped together and the glue all dried, and I took the clamps off, I had a bit of a bow in the table. I'm not really sure what happened. It wasn't there when I had left the night before, but I left it to dry overnight, and I don't know if a clamp slipped or what happened, but I ended up having to actually cut the table back in half, joint the 2 halves, and then glue it back together one more time. It was a little bit of an error on my part, I'm sure. Normally these glue-ups go pretty smooth. When I'm doing a glue up like this, I like to use Titebond 3. I know it's going to give me some extra working time, and this glue up took 15 to 20 minutes to do the first time. And so having that extra open time on the glue makes this a whole lot less stressful, even though it didn't actually go as planned on the first run through. I made sure to set my clamps where they weren't over any of the knots so I could mix up some epoxy while the glue was drying and fill those holes in. I have just a little bit of charcoal powder that I'm going to put in here to blacken it out, and then it was as simple as just pouring it down into the knot holes. With pigment, it's best to use just a really small amount. I bought this online as a sample kit a couple of years ago, and even that tiny little bag of pigment has lasted through 10, 12 projects, and there's still about half left in that tiny bag. The fill went well. I babysat it for a couple hours while it drained down into the knots. And then once the glue and the epoxy was dry the next day, I went ahead and took the clamps off. Off camera, I did cut the table in half, like I said, and glue it back together one more time. And the second glue up went pretty smooth. There's a cabinet shop local to me that has a 52-inch wide format belt sander, and they rent out time on it. All you have to do is bring them a piece, and they will go ahead and sand it out to 220 grit for you. They do require that you knock all the glue squeeze out off beforehand because it messes with the belts. So that's what I was doing there. I took it over to them, and they did a fantastic job getting it put back together. And then once I got it back in the shop, I trimmed the table out to final length and then trimmed it back out to final width as well. The clients didn't want much of a break on the edges of the table, and so I did a very, very light chamfer, and then it was time to put some finish on. I do use a lot of spray finishes in the shop. I have a high velocity, low pressure system that's mounted in a spray booth in the back area. But there's something about just using polyurethane that I like. I like how hard it dries and how easy it is to put on. I ended up over the process of the rest of this build putting on a coat just about every time I saw that the top was dry again. It ended up being probably close to 10 coats once it was all done. The client, like I said, did supply the chairs and also the table base as well. So the next step was to start getting the chairs disassembled. I ended up using all of the chairs and then just the legs from the original table base, and I rebuilt the skirt a little bit later on in the video. The chairs came apart well, and then came the arduous process of scuffing up all of the finished surfaces. At some point in their history, it looks like there might have been a little bit of wax put on them, maybe as a sealer. And so that all had to be scraped off, and then everything got sanded with 220 grit paper so the paint would stick. On recommendation from a local Sherwin-Williams, I used an extreme bond primer that they had in conjunction with a cabinet grade enamel over the top of it. Both of them were latex, but they did assure me that they would stick, even if the original clear coat was something that was oil based. The primer went on really well. It was a little cold in the shop, so doing the top coat was difficult. Since it was so thick, it was hard to get it thin enough to come out through the spray gun. But I ended up putting 2 coats of that on as well. Once that was all done, it was time to start working on the skirt. The spray booth is a little small to fit all 6 chairs, the legs, and the skirt in it, so this process and workflow worked out best for me. I temporarily set the legs and measured the length of my skirt and cut them to final length out of a board that was wide enough to rip both to ensure that the length of both boards was the same. I repeated this process for all the additional skirt pieces and placed them where they belonged on the table. I ended up doing 3 pieces as well across the middle to provide a little bit more structure for the skirt. It's sort of similar to a torsion box design, but missing some of the corner gussets. I cut some small pieces based on the length from the original table base to go into the corners. I used a speed square to mark an opposing miter on the edge of those plates. When that was done, I marked a 90-degree line from the end of that opposing 45-degree mark and marked 2 arbitrary spots for my pilot holes. The goal here is that my pilot hole will go through the most amount of wood while still coming out on the flat part of the miter so that the screws don't show on the inside of the skirt. Once I had all 4 of those done, it was time to install them. I used glue and then a couple of brad nails to hold it in temporarily, and then the screws to drive it home semi-permanently. The glue will still do the majority of the work long term. The client said that they wanted the chairs distressed, and so I did that with some 220 grit sandpaper, and then to keep it from being too contrasting, I used a dry brush to cover up the areas that I had sanded off. They still showed through, it looked a little bit better. One of the things that I found when doing distressing like this is that it's best to have the client come in for at least one of the chairs or one of the table legs or whatever it is that you're working on. Distressing isn't really quantifiable, so it's really easy to do too much. I found that I tend to err that direction instead of doing too little. But the client was happy with the first chair, and so I went ahead and did the other five and then the legs as well. While they were in, they did say that they wanted a little bit of a radius cut on the tabletop. They had some young children and didn't want to have their heads get cut on any of the corners. So I used a bottle cap to mark a radius on a scrap piece of poplar and then clamped it to the tabletop and then used a router with a flush trim bit to cut the corner off. With that router, I found it's best to do that in at least 2 passes. Ended up doing it in 3 there, just to keep from bogging the router down or having any tear out. Then I sanded off all the corners and put some finish on, and it was time for delivery. This ended up being a really fun project, and the clients really enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing it. If you guys like the video, please subscribe to the channel. You can also find us on Facebook. Thank you for watching.